Hey, welcome to Choo. My name is Jacob and I love making mead. So in this video, I'm going to show you guys how to make mead on a budget with minimal ingredients, minimal equipment. So in this video, we're going to make something akin to what they would have made back in the day, which is still made today. We're going to keep it super simple. When it comes to mead making, you can get really into it. It can get really flippin' complex. That's not what this video today is all about. So, if you're an absolute beginner, if you're just getting back into mead making and it's been a while, or you're on a bit of a budget, or you don't have much equipment or whatever, then this is the video for you. Now, the first half of this video, I'm going to waffle on about equipment and ingredients because it's important, especially if you're not heaps familiar with it. There are timestamps in the description if you want to jump to anything specifically. If you want to jump right ahead to the actual mead making process, then you can. However, if you are a beginner, I do recommend watching this whole video because you might learn a thing or two. So, let's rock and roll. Well, first of all, what is mead? Mead in its purest form is simply an alcoholic beverage made from fermenting honey. It's honey wine. It's fermented honey water, essentially. There's lots of different types of mead out there. You can add fruit to it to make melomels. You can add spice to make spice mead. You can add all kinds of different stuff, but at the end of the day, traditional mead is honey wine. See, all alcoholic beverages begin with fermentation, from delicious scotch to red wine like Shiraz to all wine to beer. No matter what you're drinking, it starts with the process of fermentation, which is when yeast eats sugar and converts that sugar to alcohol. So if we ferment the sugar from grapes, we get wine like Shiraz or Chardonnay, depending on what sort of grape variety we use, of course. If we ferment malt and barley, like if the yeast eats sugar from these things, we get beer. And if we run that beer through a still, we get whiskey. And if we ferment the sugar that is in honey, we get mead. And that's all that mead is. Mead is an umbrella term. There's lots of different types of mead. If you want more complex analysis of mead, the history of mead, and so on, then check out my Mead 101 video. But essentially, mead is the oldest, as far as we know, the oldest alcoholic beverage known to humankind. So there's a lot of history, there's a lot of nostalgia, and it's very delicious. Right, so let's get to making some mead. All you need in order to make mead is 3 ingredients. Honey, of course, water to mix it all through to create a medium, and yeast. That's it. There's lots of different types of honey. There's lots and lots of different types of yeast. There's even different types of water. So as you get more confident and competent in mead making, you might fine tune your preferences a little bit. But in this video, we're going to keep it very simple. I want to try to make this as simple as possible. We used the cheapest honey I could find in the supermarket. I'm going to use rainwater from my rainwater tank, and I'm going to use Lalvin's EC1118, which is a champagne yeast, for this tutorial. And there's a reason for that. And so bear with me here. I have to talk about yeast just a little bit because it is very important. There's lots of different types of yeast that create different flavors. Remember, yeast eats sugar and converts it into alcohol. So obviously, whatever passes through that yeast, depending on the yeast strain, we're going to get different flavors. And we, as a brewing community or an alcohol making community, over the years have cultivated yeast strains that we think work best for specific types of drinks. But even when you're getting specific, like with mead, let's say you're doing a traditional dry mead, there's still so many choices. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. You can watch other videos about that, but I will explain why I think for beginners, or if you just as a good all-rounder, you should use EC1118. It's a champagne yeast, so it is specifically cultivated for wine. Mead is essentially a type of wine, so that works really well. It also is an absolute workhorse, so it's going to crank out a decent amount of alcohol. It has a very good alcohol tolerance. Some yeasts will stop producing once they hit like 9 or 10%. EC1118 can produce as high as 18% alcohol, so if you like stronger meads, and provided you have enough honey, enough sugar in your wash, then this is a good yeast for you. It's widely available. You can pretty much pick this up at any homebrew store on earth, and of course it's available online, so you don't have to worry about trying to find a little bit more niche yeast. You can grab this guy anywhere, and it has a very good temperature tolerance, temperature range. So different yeasts will eat yeast and convert that to alcohol at different temperatures. Ideally, we want to find a perfect temperature for that specific yeast, but we don't always have that options. You don't always have heating capabilities. This means getting expensive equipment. You might not have a climate controlled room, which means your temperature is going to fluctuate a little bit. If it gets too hot, say over 35, 40 degrees, the yeast will die and become inactive. In other words, it won't convert the sugar to alcohol. If it gets too cold, the yeast gets sleepy, becomes dormant, becomes inactive, and doesn't produce alcohol. So you want to find a yeast and match that temperature. Like I said, you can't always do that. EC1118 has a pretty decent temperature range. I think the yeast will remain active, create alcohol from something like 12 degrees to up to 30 degrees. Don't quote me on that, but it does have quite a broad range, which means if it gets too cold overnight, the yeast is going to keep working. It might slow down a bit, but it's going to keep producing alcohol. If it gets too warm, the yeast is going to keep producing alcohol. Again, this is not ideal. We want constant temperature, preferably. That's not always an option, so that's why I recommend EC1118. It is an absolute tank of a yeast, perfect for beginners, and it produces a pretty decent tasting mead, even if you do get a bit of fluctuation. It's not the best necessarily, but taste is subjective. I've never had a problem with EC1118. That's why I recommend it. I mean, think about it, man. Back in the day, they didn't have temperature control, and people have been making mead for something like 8,000 years. They didn't have electric heating mats on their thing. They just had yeast that just worked, and people did it. Now, of course, we are not living in the past. We have better understanding of chemistry, and we have better technology, but still, we do have limitations. Some of us have budgetary limitations. Sometimes it might get a bit too complex. We don't really know what we're doing. Get a yeast that has a good range of temperature, a good workhorse. The reason I like EC1118, I've just mentioned all the reasons, and it just works. So I recommend it. So before we get into making the mead, we have to talk about equipment, what sort of equipment you need. At the end of the day, you need one thing, a bucket, some kind of vessel in which to mix it all together so that your fermentation can take place. That's all you need. That's all they did back in the day, was open fermentation. However, there are certain risks with this, so there's a few extra little things that will just increase your quality of life and mitigate risks. One of those things is an airlock. Now, you don't need a fancy demijohn like this. These are about 20 bucks. This is 5 liters as well, so it's not huge. I usually rack into this and use this for aging. An airlock is very essential. You see, when yeast eats sugar, it produces alcohol, like we said, but it also produces gas, most notably CO2. So if I was to seal this thing properly, the gas would build up and I'd end up with a bottle bomb. You don't want that. If I leave this open, I run the risk of getting bugs in there. Fruit flies love mead. Remember, mead's kind of citrusy, it's kind of fruity because of the honey. Bugs love getting in there. Also, if too much oxygen gets in there, it oxidizes, we get off flavors. You don't want that. So what you want is a way for the gas to get out without letting bugs in, and that's when an airlock comes into play. It's not necessary. Some people can just put a balloon on there with a pinprick in it, but they're like 5 bucks. It's gonna absolutely eliminate a lot of risks. Remember, honey's a little bit expensive too. It's like 10 times more expensive than sugar. So you don't want to risk contaminating your mead because it's a lot of money, it's a lot of time, and also honey is a little bit slower to ferment. So after 5 weeks or whatever, if you're about to crack open your mead and see what it's like and you've contaminated it, it's a bit of a bummer, especially if you don't have 10 or 20 of these things on the go at once. Highly recommend getting an airlock. Now, I had a bit of trouble with this. I bought a bung that was supposed to sit in there. I couldn't get it to stay in there. It fucking kept popping out, really pissed me off. So here's a little pro tip, blue tack. Get blue tack. If you have a dry rim, blue tack is the best. It will absolutely seal that. It's not going to introduce any contaminants. It just works. So get yourself a vessel, get yourself an airlock. The other thing you might want is just a pot to mix it all together, a spoon, maybe some scales to weigh the honey. These are not essential, but they kind of help. You probably have them in your kitchen anyway. There is one other thing though that, again, is not necessary, but I highly, highly recommend it. And that is a hydrometer. We're going to explain how this works a little bit later in the video, but in a nutshell, a hydrometer is going to tell you how strong your mead is, how strong your alcohol is, okay? Without one of these are like 5 bucks or 10 bucks, by the way. Without one of these, there's no way of knowing how much alcohol has been produced. There's just, unless you get really, really expensive equipment or you have perfect palate, which you don't. So you don't need to measure how much alcohol you're producing. If you just don't care, you don't have to drive anywhere, then go for it. But it is fun to know exactly how strong our booze is. Without a hydrometer, that's not possible. So get yourself a hydrometer. I recommend getting 1 or 2 or 3 because they're very fragile. They do tend to break easily, and that's fucking annoying. I'll explain how hydrometers work later on, but that's essentially it. Something to brew in. An airlock. You can get a bucket from Bunnings, drill a hole in the top, and put an airlock in that with a bit of blue tack. I do that all the time because it's cheap, and if you want a bigger vessel, a 20-liter, 5-gallon bucket that's food grade from Bunnings, for example, costs like 6 bucks. If I wanted a 20-liter demijohn, I'm going to be paying like 60, 70 bucks. So I highly recommend buckets. They work fine for the initial fermentation, not so good for aging. Grab an airlock, grab a bucket, get yourself a hydrometer, and of course those 3 ingredients, honey, yeast, and water, and we're ready to go. So let's make some mead.
First, we start by dissolving the honey in some warm water. Make sure not to use boiling water, as this will chemically alter the honey. It will burn away all the subtle floral and citrusy characteristics in the honey, the very thing that we want to shine through in mead, and will leave you with just sugary flavors, in which case you should just use white sugar as it's so much cheaper. So slightly warm water is good enough to dissolve the honey. Don't overheat it. As far as ratios go, my rule is 25 to 35% of my overall volume should be honey, so roughly a third. This is subjective, but this is a good starting point. So if I'm making 10 liters of mead, I want to use about 3 kilos of honey, then fill the remainder of the container to 10 liters. So 3 parts honey, 7 parts water. This will give enough sugar for the yeast to produce a decent amount of alcohol and still be a little sweet to the taste. As you get more experience, this is yet another thing you can experiment with. Add less honey for drier, lower alcohol mead, more for sweeter or stronger meads, and so on. And you can match this with the type of yeast you're using and blah, blah, blah. So many variables, but this is a good general rule. 1 part honey to 2 or 3 parts water works well. I'm making 5 liters of mead in this video, so I'm using about 1.5, 1.6 kilos of honey or thereabouts. Once dissolved, put it in your container and fill the remainder of the volume with water. We're about to add our yeast, but first, this is the perfect time to take a hydrometer reading. Hydrometers measure what we call gravity. Simply put, it's going to tell us how much sugar is in the mix. Yeast eats sugar and turns it into alcohol. So if we take a reading now and then a reading after fermentation is complete, there should be less sugar at the end because it's been converted to alcohol. The difference, we assume, has been turned to alcohol by the yeast, and this will tell us how strong our mead is. We know how much we started with, we know how much we're left with, the difference is alcohol. But you don't have to worry about all the fancy maths. Just find an online gravity calculator and punch in the 2 numbers, the first reading and then the final reading, and it will calculate your ABV, your alcohol by volume, for you. I have put a link to an online calculator in the description below. You cannot simply take a final reading. To get an accurate result, you must have 2 numbers, one before and one post. Now, reading a hydrometer can be annoying, as they are often marked stupidly in my opinion, and I see this question pop up on forums all the time. The first number here is not 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 and so on. It's actually 1.01, 1.02, 1.03 and so on. Only when you get to the second set of numbers will it read 1.1, 1.11, 1.12 and so on. This throws people off all the time, so just be aware of that. A good starting number is somewhere between 1.07 and 1.1. Then a good final number after fermentation should be somewhere between 1.02 and 1.00. Using our gravity calculator, we can see how strong our mead is, and we can always stabilize and back sweeten if it ends up too dry. Again, this is a variable that you will experiment with as you get better and more competent at mead making. But that's a little bit more complex, and I've dedicated an entire video to how to stabilize wine and mead, essentially how to stop the yeast from eating all the sugar so you can end up with a sweeter mead. So please check that out as you go on your mead making journey. Once we have taken our first reading, it's time to add our yeast. You can pitch that yeast straight on top if you want. You don't even have to stir it in, but you can if you want. In the old days, they just would have thrown it in and walked away. There's heaps of things you can do at this stage. You can add yeast nutrients, pectines if you're using fruit. You can acclimate your yeast, which means soaking it for a little bit first. You can add spices. You can do all kinds of things, but for the sake of this video, we're keeping it simple. We're doing it the old-fashioned way. Just mix everything together and let the yeast do its thing. And that's it. Chuck your airlock on. Keep it out of direct sunlight. You can wrap a towel around it if it's glass. Keep it in a warm but not boiling hot spot in the house. Wait a few weeks and you've just made your first mead. Congratulations, friends. You are now mead makers. Honey's a little bit slow. It might take 3 to 5 weeks depending on your volume, depending on your yeast, depending on temperature and so many different things, but expect to wait at least 3 weeks. And you can't really bottle it at this stage unless you kill or stop the yeast, because if it keeps fermenting, which yeast will often do, and you seal the bottle, as mentioned, the gas will build up and you'll have little bottle bombs. Again, check out my stabilization video. Also, when the yeast is done, it'll often sink to the bottom of the container and you get these dregs, which are perfectly fine to drink, but they're not the most desirable. So here we typically do a technique called racking. Here's a clip of me racking a blackberry and cherry wine after primary fermentation. Racking is when you remove the clearer mead from the container whilst leaving behind the murky gunk, typically by siphoning it out. It's a pretty simple technique. It's not a necessary step, but it will help you clear up your mead, as will time. A good mead should be aged for 6 months to a year before being drunk, and should be racked a bunch of times during this as well. This will help clarify the mead. Again, this is more for aesthetics, but it can remove some yeasty flavors. But perhaps that is a video for another time. Again, you can keep it as simple or as complex as you want. If you are struggling to get your head around stabilization, I recommend just keeping your mead in the fridge. As mentioned, if it's too cold, the yeast will become dormant, so fermentation will stop and you won't get bottle bombs. But learning to stabilize is a pretty crucial step in advancing your mead making skills, so please check out that video at a later date. But at the end of the day, if you just put it all in a bucket, keep an airlock on there, you could probably even keep that for up to 6 months before it starts to over-oxidize. You don't need to put it in the fridge, you don't need to stabilize, you don't need to bottle it, but these are steps that you will probably want to do later on in your journey. And that's it.
And there you have it, guys. That's pretty much how to make a very, very simple mead. As you get better and more confident and more into the hobby, there's so many choices. You're going to be picking different types of yeast. You're going to be picking different types of honey and getting all these interesting floral characteristics from different types of honey that are derived from different types of flowers and blossoms and this kind of stuff. You might even choose different types of water. A lot of people recommend pure spring water. I don't really give a shit, but some people do. You might end up racking it. You might end up adding fruit to it. You might end up adding spices to it. It's so complex. There's an infinite amount of mead. The only limitation is your imagination. But if this helps you get into mead, then please like, subscribe, check out our homebrew playlist because I'm doing a whole bunch of stuff there. We've got heaps of videos on all kinds of weird experiments. Some worked out really well, most work out pretty well, but occasionally I'll upload a video of a failed experiment because I'm just sharing my journey as we go through this crazy world. So, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers. Oh, that is... It truly is the nectar of the gods. See you next time, guys.